So we're learning to make a quilt together, part 2. I'm very honored to see you came back after part 1, which was cutting the fabric. Today we're going to sew that fabric right back together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am Rob Appell from Michael Miller Fabrics. Welcome to Making It Fun. This is going to be a fun little series of videos I'm trying to do right now while we're staying at home and we're taking on wonderful new hobbies and all kinds of great projects. And I know there's a bunch of folks that are looking at quilting right now as something to do to keep themselves occupied. This is great. So again, welcome to the club, welcome to the family, welcome to the habit, man. You just can't stop doing this stuff once you get started. I'm obviously wound up about it. Excited. Now, if you stay with me through the whole video series, and I'm going to try to make these short little videos, you'll end up with the knowledge to make these blocks. And if you make enough blocks, you'll end up with a fantastic quilt. So today, like I said, we're focusing right on sewing back together, which we call the patchwork portion of the project here. Ooh, don't say that too many times fast. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to use my wonderful cotton couture fabrics. These are Michael Miller's beautiful solids. They're a high density fabric, which means that they have a really nice tight weave, so they're not going to shift around as much. As a new quilter, it's going to make it easier to cut and sew these together, and it's just got a fantastic feel, or what we call hand. So I'll teach you some vocabulary as we go along as well. Speaking of which, I'm going to put my solids together, right sides together, and in most sewing and quilting projects, that's where we start in the first process. Right sides together, and if these were printed fabrics like you see behind me, that would mean the prints would go next to each other, and you wouldn't see the prints, but you would see their back sides. Crazy enough, right? The other thing we always do is we sew these patchworks together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and no matter who you ask or who you measure, they're always different for one reason or another. What I really want you to learn today from me here is whatever you do seam allowance wise from start to finish, it should be very close to a 1/4 inch, and the reason I say that is patterns like this are written for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and they have these points, and those points will go missing if you don't respect that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And some folks will use what's called a scant 1/4 inch, which is a little bit less than 1/4, but that way when you press over the fabric and the thread and everything, that compensates and makes a perfect 1/4 inch. Most of you, the best thing you can do is really take a moment and practice and measure and press and all of this and find where you're most happy on your sewing machine, which is your 1/4 inch or your patchwork markings. I like to use a 1/4 inch foot, but then I also use an edge guide on my machines, because with an edge guide, I can actually set a slightly different seam allowance, because in this wonderful studio I have, thanks to Juki, I've got fantastic sewing machines all around the room, and I like to use different ones at different times of the day because I can. I'm spoiled, right? Yeah, that's right. I just said I use different machines on the same project, and the key to that is using an edge guide so I can always make sure that that seam allowance is exactly the same no matter which machine I start and finish on. So there's a little rumor dispelling going on there, but I want you to understand, whatever you do, do it always the same in that quilt so that you always have matching work. Now, as I come over to the machine here, the presser foot on the machine is in the up position, so I can slide the fabric right underneath. And I like to start actually either just in front of the fabric a little bit like this and sew into it, or I will also start actually back on the fabric and drop my presser foot. And then what I'll do is I'll sew in reverse a couple stitches, and then I'll go forward, and that locks in that stitch. And that way, as I'm pressing it open later on, it's not going to have a tendency to start to unravel as we go over it in other directions. As these seams start to cross over each other, they also lock each other together and make the entire fabric body stronger and stronger with each process. It's pretty cool that way. So for me, anyways, I'm just stitching this. I'm going to sew from that beginning all the way to the end with a nice straight seam. And again, as I get towards the end of my patchwork, I also like to back stitch. So I'm going to take a couple stitches backwards and forwards just like that. And now I happen to have a hot rod sewing machine, so my foot is automatically raising just slightly for me, which is just a feature. You don't need that. You could always raise your presser foot and pull the thread out, and you're going to look for this just really nice, even 1/4 inch seam allowance. Super easy, super smooth, just like that. I see I've got just a few minutes left on the clock, so I want to show you one other thing, which is what we call chain piecing. And by chain piecing, you can get a little more work done in a hurry And so what you're going to do is you're going to prepare a couple of your patchworks before you go to the sewing machine. And then when you get to your sewing machine, you'll be able to go ahead and come up to that machine. You can lower your presser foot, take a couple stitches in, couple stitches back, and some machines will actually suck the fabric in at that moment. It could be that you're using a dull needle. It could be you have too wide of a stitch plate. I actually have a single hole plate on because it also helps with the patchwork. Oops, as I come to the end, let's talk about this. I'm going to back stitch, and then I'm going to also sew forward, and this is what we call chain piecing. So I'm going to grab that other piece of fabric, let that presser foot automatically lift for me because I can, and then as I start sewing again, it's going to drop, but I need to back stitch because I like to back stitch. So we're going to back stitch it every brand new patchwork, and then I would just chain on and on and on and back stitch at the end of the patchwork. And you could do this by the hundreds, and you just do that step by step at a time, and you get all of your patchwork, your 1/4 inch seam allowances put together so that when you are set, you are ready to go to the next step, which is pressing. Step 3, we'll see you there.